following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Perspectives. My name is David Schoeneman. I'm your host on this program. I'm also the alderman for Ward 3 here in Nashua. On Perspectives, we take a look at a variety of issues on a state, local, and national level in an effort to keep you informed about what is happening in the world around you. There are many, many events these days that affect us directly, even here in Nashua. Today we're going to take a look a little further afield, though. We're going to take a look at the international situation that's occurring over in the Middle East right now. As you know, we've had the rise of ISIS, the advance of Islam in the region, a civil war in Syria, and a battle today that's being waged in Mosul to try to get ISIS out of that city in Iraq. It's a situation that is producing many millions of refugees who may end up here in New Hampshire or even in Nashua at some point. So these are issues that, although they seem far away, they do affect us day by day right here. With me to talk about this today is Joel Richardson. Joel Richardson is a New York Times best-selling author of a book called The Islamic Antichrist. He's an expert in Islam, Middle East affairs, he's a human rights activist, and he's an itinerant minister. Joel, welcome. Thank you very much for coming in.
It's good to be here with you, David.
The issue of being involved in the Middle East or being an expert on Islam is one that I think a lot of folks at home would like to have some familiarity with. We don't know too much really here in America about what Islam is all about. We see coexist bumper stickers. We hear people say it's the God of the Quran is the same God as the God of the Bible, therefore we should all be able to get along. But Islam is in fact very, very different from biblical Christianity. And I wonder if you could just share some of your perspective on the nature and source of Islam, whatever you can tell us about Islam.
Sure. Well, you know, it's interesting that you mentioned the coexist bumper stickers, because I think before you even begin talking about Islam, we have to acknowledge that in many ways, I'll say, the spirit of the age, or even the religion of our time, whether people call it their religion or not, it really is religious pluralism. Or you could say multiculturalism. And really the idol of our age, the God of our age, is tolerance. And so first of all, let me just say, tolerance is a very good thing. The United States, you know, give us your poor, tired, huddled masses yearning to breathe free. This is tolerance, and openness is one of the principles that has made this country great. However, when you take the principle of tolerance and you put it above issues such as civil liberties, freedom, equality, it can actually become a self-destructive principle. It's a principle that needs to have limitations. So tolerance is good within limitations. It has to be prioritized below the principles of liberty, of freedom, of equality, and these sort of things. So unfortunately today it has been elevated to the place of the one principle that cannot be violated. And so therefore, most more secular thinking Westerners, Americans, we are not able to properly analyze and discern the nature of Islam, because we say all religions are equal or equally invalid, depending on which way you lean. And so we don't have the ability to criticize another religion, you know, unless it's a small religion, or unless it's, you know, Christianity, Judaism. It's fairly popular and trendy today to criticize. Right. Familiarity breeds contempt. Most Westerners are familiar with Christianity, and so I think people feel comfortable criticizing that which they're familiar with. But with Islam, they view it as sort of an outside, exotic sort of force, and you know, it's the religion of immigrants and so forth, so we don't want to criticize it. And again, it violates the principle that all religions are equally valid or equally invalid. So if we put aside, I think, this mentally crippling, this discernment-destroying mentality that's so popular today, we can look at Islam and just analyze it from a purely, I mean, just a rational, even statistical, even scientific perspective. You look at the Quran. The Quran has 17% of the Quran consists of anti-Semitic, racist statements against Jews, compared to 7% of Mein Kampf has anti-Semitic statements. Okay, so just, statistically, you look at that and you go, what will happen to the person who believes that this is the divinely inspired Word of God and who is, seeking to live their life around the tenets of the Quran, where 17% of the Quran, just statistically, you go through verse by verse, is anti-Semitic statements. Okay, so, you have this you have a religion. Now, let me just say this. Your average Muslim is fairly Quranically illiterate. They're not really familiar with the Quran. Most Christians, I'm an itinerant minister, I would say a high percentage of Christians are fairly biblically illiterate. They study the Bible a little bit, but the Bible is most often translated into multiple languages. Muslims believe that the Quran can only be properly read or recited in Arabic. And so you have Muslims from all over the world who have no idea how to read the Quran. They learn how to recite it in Arabic, but they don't speak Arabic. And so they're often ignorant of what the Quran actually says. So the reason I say that is because the majority of Muslims today are wonderful people. They're not terrorists. They're not, I shouldn't say, because there is a very high percentage of anti-Semitism among Muslims. But when it comes to this sort of classic question, how many are terrorists? Most experts seem to say that it's roughly 10 to 15% of the Islamic world. Now that's a minority. On the other hand, when you look at the fact that you have roughly 1.62 billion Muslims worldwide, 15% of 1.62 billion, you're up to 200 some odd million Muslims would be considered jihadis or terrorists. The United States population right now is 320, 30 million. So you're dealing with almost the entire population of the United States. So yes, it's a problem. Islam is a problem, but we need to be able to separate Muslims from Islam, to recognize that Islam at its very foundation is a fundamentally totalitarian, intolerant, archaic religion, and it is not compatible with multiculturalism. It's not. On the other hand, not all Muslims are going to adhere to all of the tenets of Islam, and so this is a very difficult topic. I mean, it's a very difficult, nuanced issue to approach, and we need to approach it informed, with our hearts right, not given over to sensationalism, but to acknowledge the realities that we're dealing with.
Yeah. I've heard that, of course, we hear that church and state need to be separated. And I've heard people speak about mosque and state not really being separated because there's no way to separate, that Islam is, in fact, a political and legal system as much and perhaps more than it is a religion. Yeah. Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, they call it Sharia, which simply means Islamic law. And so Muslims believe that part of their way of living is to obey Allah's laws, obey God's laws. And so to the Muslim, Islam is a holistic, complete worldview. It's a holistic way of life. And you can't separate Islamic law from Islamic morality or any of these sort of things. And so whereas in the West we often do compartmentalize. We have sort of the sacred and the secular, we have the government and then our religion, and those are separated. But to the Muslim mindset, there is no such division.
If we were to talk about the God of the Quran and the God of the Bible, how would you compare and contrast those two? Are they the same?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the answer is, and again, I say this as a theologian. I've been studying this for 20 some odd years, and long relationships with thousands of Muslims, and debated thousands of Muslims, and so forth. The answer is yes and no.
Oh.
Okay, so the answer is yes, in that as a Christian I say there's only one God. There's only one creator. There's only one genuine God who made all things. And so if you were to ask Muslims, do you believe in one God who created all things? They would say yes. But when you sort of dig a little bit below the surface and you look at the fundamental, the essence of who the God of the Bible is versus the God of the Quran, the God of the Bible, the very foundation of who he is a self-revealing, condescending God. What that means is, although he made everything and he's transcendent, he's beyond our ability to grasp or understand or comprehend, he has chosen to lower himself, to reveal himself to us because he loves us. So throughout the Bible, he's actually, throughout the Old Testament, he's appearing. He wrestles with Jacob. He shows himself to Hagar. He comes down in the form of the angel of the Lord. And ultimately, this self-revealing God is revealed in the most ultimate sense by actually taking on flesh and becoming the Messiah, becoming Jesus. The God of heaven actually sent forth his very essence, his very heart into the world to reveal himself to his creation, to mankind. The God of the Quran, the very essence of the God of the Quran, I mean, some of the most fundamental doctrines of Islam is that God is not a father. God has no son. And so from an Islamic perspective, the God of the Quran is purely transcendent, purely other than, purely great, purely beyond our ability to comprehend. And again, Christians agree with that, but we say, but God has chosen to reveal himself. Muslims say, no, don't ever speak of God in terms such as father or having sent his son or any of these things, because when you use that language, you're using the language of the earth. You're lowering God, and that's blasphemy. In fact, the most basic historical doctrines of the Christian faith, the divine incarnation of God in Christ, that God took on flesh, that Jesus died on the cross for the sins of mankind, he made atonement for us, these sort of things, these are considered to be the greatest form of blasphemy within Islam. So, I always use the analogy. I say, listen, father comes home from work, he's exhausted. I have 5 kids. The kids say, as soon as you walk in, Daddy, Daddy, play with me. My daughters, what do you want to play? I get down on the ground, play dolls. My 5-year-old son, I get down on the floor, I wrestle with him. Another father walks in and the kids say, Daddy, Daddy's home, Daddy, play with me. And he says, no, I'm far too important to play with kids. Play with your siblings. Don't you know that I'm whatever, I'm the CEO of the largest diesel fuel supplier in the whole tri-state, whatever, I'm amazing. This is the difference between the God of the Bible and the God of the Quran. The God of the Bible is fundamentally condescending. He humiliated himself on the cross. He was mutilated for mankind because he loves his children. The God of the Quran is all about preserving his greatness, protecting his greatness. Nay, it is not befitting the majesty of Allah that he should have a son. And it actually it refers to Christians in the Quran, and it says, they say that Allah has had a son. The earth is about to crack apart because this is such great blasphemy, this sort of thing. So, I always ask people, I say, look, between these 2 fathers, which one would you want to be your father? And I think the God of the Bible is emotionally, philosophically, theologically, so much more appealing. It meets the need of all of mankind to connect with a God who feels our pain, who cares about us, versus this God that's just all about, because true greatness doesn't need to be protected. True greatness doesn't need to be preserved. And so from my perspective, and I know it's profoundly politically incorrect, but to me, the God of the Quran is not God at all. He's an insecure pretender who's pretending to be God, and he's not worthy of worship in any way, shape, or form. And that which Muslims are yearning for, the one true God of creation, can be found in the Bible, but most certainly not in the Quran.
I would agree with that. I think the notion that they're the same in any way is just wrong. Even though they say they worship the one true God. I could have a head of lettuce on the table, and if I call that the one true God, clearly that's not the same as the God in the Bible, no matter what I might think of it.
Sure.
And one of the things that the Bible says is that God is never changing. Same yesterday, today, and forever. And he wouldn't, it sounds like he couldn't reveal himself as a stern father, a distant father, to a people that require that. And then at the same time, as a close, condescending father to those on the other side who do want that and need that. That would be contradictory because it would not be the same character. In the end, I think that the 2 characters are vastly different, and one is God and one is not.
When you look at the very foundation of Islam, where did it come from? How was it birthed? Muhammad was this young man in Arabia. He was in a cave called the Cave of Hira. He was fasting and praying. He had this experience. He had this encounter with a spirit. He says it was Gabriel, the angel. But if you read Islamic source documents, you read their histories, it says that this presence came over him, and it says he was terrified. It was crushing him. He felt as though he was going to die, and it demanded of him in Arabic, Iqra, recite. This is where we get the word Quran, Iqran, the recitation. And he said, I don't know how to recite. And this happened 3 times. This presence was crushing him. After the 3rd time, it demanded, Ikra. He finally allowed the words to come forward. He allowed the Spirit to sort of channel through him. This is the first words of the Quran. Now you read, again, this is Islamic source documents. Muhammad, for weeks, was suicidal after this experience. He believed he was demon-possessed. He went home to his wife Khadijah, 15 years older than him, convinced him that he was a prophet, convinced him to start going with it, to allow these experiences to happen. This is how the Quran is inspired. It doesn't take tremendous amount of discernment to recognize that that was not the angel Gabriel. Within the biblical narratives, the angels appear and they say, fear not. They touch people as they visit, they comfort them, they stand and they say, I've been sent from the Most High. They don't come and just crush people, choke them, demand of them, start saying these things. And so to me, when you look at just the initial inspiration of Islam, this is not to insult our Muslim friends.
Of course not.
But I think if you have any discernment at all, you can recognize that this was not a divine act of inspiration. This was a demonic encounter. Now, in modern times, if we were to point some religion today, David Koresh, some little religion, it would be very easy for people to say, oh, this guy's clearly a deceiver. He's a cult leader. Because Islam has taken off, because it's spread all over the world and it's now such a large religion, we go, you can't say that. You can't offend Muslims. But somehow if it's a small religion, it's okay to point out, no, this is clearly a cult. Muhammad was a cult leader. And the difference between him and a David Koresh or any number of various cult leaders is that Muhammad and his religion has been profoundly successful, and it has deceived and swept up billions, 1.62 billion people into this deception.
Yeah, it's certainly very fast-growing religion. I understand it's the fastest growing by birth. Christianity, I believe, is still fastest growing by conversion, if I'm not mistaken. But we seem to have a clash of religions, and this is seen no more clearly than it is in the Middle East. And right now we've got all kinds of turmoil over there. We have the rise of ISIS, which is going for an Islamic caliphate, trying to assert Quranic law throughout the region and spreading beyond that, and of course the civil war in Syria. And the refugee issue. Now we talked about refugees a little bit before too. If we transition to the refugee situation in the world, what's happening there and what are we likely to see?
Well, you know, we have the mess in the Middle East. When the Obama administration came in, there was a shift in their foreign policy. They said, no longer are we going to deal with these sort of third-rate Middle Eastern military dictators and autocrats. We are now going to shift to try to deal with more moderate Islamist governments. So there was a very deliberate effort on the Obama administration's part to remove folks like Mubarak and Gaddafi and Assad. Obviously, the program began even back under Bush with Saddam Hussein. The Obama administration was successful with Mubarak and Gaddafi, but they obviously ran into a huge roadblock with Assad. And so now we have a few 100,000 people dead. We have one of the most beautiful nations in the Middle East, a historical, beautiful nation in rubble. We have millions of people fleeing the chaos, and we're feeling the unintended consequences of our efforts in the Middle East. And again, I want to be clear, this begins all the way back with Bush. And so now we're having to deal with this reality of the United States has been partially responsible, not solely responsible, but we've had a very strong hand in people's lives being in complete chaos. Now people are afraid. They see terrorism on TV. They go, we don't want to bring refugees over here from Syria. They could be ISIS terrorists and this sort of thing. First of all, we need to recognize there is a significant difference between the illegal refugees that are walking from the Middle East through Turkey into Europe and those that are coming over here through the legal refugee process, which takes a few years. And despite what some of my slightly more alarmist conservative friends would say, it is a fairly stringent process that they have to go through. And I would also say, as a Christian, it is our responsibility to care for the refugees. That said, the vetting process needs to be thorough. Trump has said extreme vetting. I think we are a nation of immigrants.
Sure.
And we need to do the right thing. Because when we force them to stay in bad situations, one, we're condemning them to death, and oftentimes leading to their radicalization. And then we're going to end up feeling it elsewhere. On the other hand, when you combine the immigration process with this current program of multiculturalism, that is a recipe for disaster.
Right. It's been a disaster in Europe and France and England. It's just been a total catastrophe.
Right, right. And of course, again, because much of them, there's no vetting.
Right.
They're just, they're just strolling in and so forth. My grandparents were immigrants from Portugal and Poland and different places. When immigrants come and integrate into a culture, into a society to a degree, if there is sort of a common American culture, then that works. But when we are doing everything we can to accommodate their culture and so forth, that is a recipe for disaster. And it's just like we go, oh, but who are we to impose our culture, etc. Look, if I as an American were to move over to Iraq and I tried to impose and just live my American life, everybody would say, oh, come on, you typical American.
Right.
Well, you should, So if it goes the other way, we're very sensitive. So likewise, if immigrants are coming over here, there should be an expectation of a certain degree of integration and an assumption that they value many of the principles which make our country who we are. Now, granted, we might fall down on many of these principles, but when it comes to the principles, as I said, freedom, liberty, equality, if you don't agree with and have a value for those things, then you probably should consider moving elsewhere. And that's not a racist or a bigoted approach. That is reasonable. It's wise, and I think there's a degree of political correctness that, as I said, it blinds us to simply being rational. We need to have wisdom.
We do, because we're not just bringing Syrians over, we're bringing Syrian Muslims over who
Sure.
follow the Quran and Islam. And we talked earlier about the fact that Islam it's a political system, and I think it's a political system that's repressive and really runs contrary to everything that we have here under the United States Constitution. Right. So if we want to tolerate a worldview inside of our borders that would like to supplant the worldview that we've had here for this period of time, I think we're asking for trouble. It's just, it's a conflict that's really not too far away.
Well, yeah, and this is the thing, again, is, within the vetting process, there needs to be legitimate questions in terms of, because Sharia law, Islamic law, it's going to have a spectrum, everything from, okay, if they want to eat, halal
Sure.
foods, okay, well, you go, well, Jews have kosher food, so what's wrong with that? But when it comes to their eventually, to where they're trying to impose, Muslim cab drivers won't pick somebody up because they have a dog, or, you're drinking alcohol. When they start trying to impose their values onto the culture, this is where it becomes a problem. But I want to be clear. So let's say we bring over Syrian Muslims. The majority of them are not looking to establish Islamic law. The majority of them, clearly the vast majority, if you were to go into Syria, they didn't want Sharia law. They liked living under Assad. He's not the best guy in the world, but for 20 some odd years, people lived under Assad,
Right.
whether Alawites, Christians, Sunni, Shia, and they lived with a relatively pluralistic society. And many Muslims are looking for freedom from the radicals coming over here.
That's good to
So
know.
we need to be careful of xenophobia. As I hate to say it, but Trump said in the last debate, he said a large percentage of these Syrian refugees have the values of ISIS. That's nonsense. If they're articulating, again, look, if you're an ISIS supporter, you don't come in through the American legal refugee process. You walk across the border, you fly in on a plane.
Right.
You don't come over as a refugee. That's the longest, most drawn-out process. And it's going to be very difficult for them to get in to really lie through all the testing and vetting. So, again, there's some fear, there's some irrational fears, and then on the other hand, there's some ignorance. And we need to have a wise approach, a wise and loving approach.
Makes sense. We don't have a lot of time left, and we talked before the show about the influence of Saudi Arabia in Washington, D.C. Now, I know that's a big topic.
Yeah.
In just a few minutes, what can you tell us about what you've observed about the Saudi Arabian influence in D.C.?
Well, okay, if we're talking ISIS, if we're talking Al-Qaeda, if we're talking any number of some of the most radical jihadist groups throughout the world, their ideological foundation, their ideological source, and their funding is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the single greatest funder of the most radical, violent, intolerant form of Islam that has ever existed. Call it Wahhabism, call it Salafism, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, they all come from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has given more money to American presidents, politicians. They have corrupted Washington more than any other lobby group in the history of mankind. Saudi Arabia has effectively carried out the greatest evangelism propaganda campaign in the history of mankind. Now, whether we're talking Jimmy Carter, whether we're talking both Bushes, talking the Clintons, they have absolutely received tens of millions of dollars from this incredibly terrorist-supporting family. A single family, a single government, has put into the pockets of one of our candidates, Hillary Clinton, $30+ million. This is the elephant in the room in Washington. And I think the American public needs to say, any politician running for government, if we want to get out that corruption and all of the sweetheart deals that go with it, we need to say any politician needs to promise they will not receive a single penny from the Saudi royal family. And Hillary Clinton, as Trump demanded during the debate, should give every bit of the money back. But she won't. But she should. This is the single greatest source. I don't care anything else that you name. Saudi Arabia is the single greatest source of corruption in Washington today.
Yeah, that money doesn't come without an expectation
Exactly.
for a favor later. And of course, Israel, the fate of Israel hangs in the balance. And we've talked about this before too, where you see how isolated and how surrounded Israel is in the Middle East. And the United States, a long-term ally, seems to be a little more willing to turn its back on Israel. And with money like that flowing into the pockets of someone who could be president, you don't see much loyalty in the horizon continuing for Israel.
Right. Well, of course, President Obama. I'm not saying I'm not in the camp of he's a secret Muslim, but to me, he clearly has Muslim sympathies because he grew up for a good part of his childhood as a Muslim. He clearly had very strong pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel sympathies, and as a result, he was the most he had the most negative perspective toward Israel of any American president, and this is unprecedented. The disrespect that he showed toward Netanyahu, toward Israel, and unfortunately, people always, there's all these conspiracy theories. Oh, the Jews are controlling everything. They're corrupting Washington with the Jewish lobby. Look, any amount of money that the Jewish lobby is a very legitimate lobby. They have concerns just like any other lobby group. The amount of money that they put into Washington is a drop in the bucket compared to the Saudi lobby. And again, as you said, these Saudi sheikhs, they are not giving $30 million to the Clintons because they really value HIV medicine in Africa, or because they value the Clinton initiative. That's nonsense. They are investing in their future. And anybody who thinks otherwise is willfully ignorant.
Well, we don't want to be willfully ignorant. That's why we're doing the show, and that's why you're doing the things that you're doing. I've attended some of your talks. I've certainly enjoyed them, and I read The Islamic Antichrist. It's a very interesting premise in that book. Basically, the Quran, or the Islamic faith, is looking for a savior, and the Christian faith is anticipating an Antichrist. And if we look at the character that's described, that characteristic, we find that they could be the same individual.
Yeah, I call it a comparative analysis of biblical and Islamic end-time perspectives, and I demonstrate that the biblical narrative for the last days and the Islamic narrative for the last days, their expectations, it's like a mirror image. I call it an anti-parallel. And their primary end-time Messiah figure, known as the Mahdi, the 12th Imam, that he is in so many ways a perfect mirror image of the biblical Antichrist. And, whether even if you're not a Christian, you don't believe in any of these things, Islamic apocalyptic belief is driving ISIS, for instance. This is one of the greatest recruiting factors behind ISIS, is many of these young kids joining ISIS, 35,000 plus kids from outside of Syria and Iraq. They believe their Islamic prophecies are being fulfilled. And it's used as a recruiting tool, and it's dangerous. Whether we're geopolitical analysts, military, political, etc., we need to understand Islamic apocalyptic because it's affecting the world today in a profound way.
Well, thank you very much. The book was great. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I would encourage any of our viewers to take a look at that book if you have a chance to. I'm with Joel Richardson today, a New York Times best-selling author of a number of books, one of which is The Islamic Antichrist that we just touched on now, and an expert in Islam and Middle Eastern affairs. I want to thank you, Joel, for coming in, and I want to thank you folks for tuning in. It's a pleasure to have you here, and we will see you next time.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.